found the Nippur tablet because I was looking for something else. That is how these things work, more often than not. The significant discovery arrives sideways, through a door you opened for entirely different reasons. The tablet records the oldest flood story ever written, not the version you know, and it names the survivor, his city, the god who warned him. But before all of that, before the flood and the boat and the chosen man, the same document lists 8 kings who ruled 5 cities. Their names are in the record, their reigns documented, their cities real. After the floodline, the sequence restarts, as if that earlier world never existed. The explanation for the break is not in the surviving clay. The Sumerian King List is not a religious document. That matters more than it sounds. When I first started tracing these records, not looking for the flood story, looking for something else entirely, what I kept running into was a text that read less like scripture and more like a ledger. City by city, king by king, reign by reign. The document was copied and recopied across centuries. Archaeologists have recovered approximately 16 known versions, no two identical, all preserving the same essential structure. Real dynasties used it to anchor their claims to power. The scribes who maintained it were not mythographers. They were administrators of legitimacy. What that means is that everything in this document was put there on purpose. Every name, every number, every city, chosen, preserved, transmitted. The earliest section begins before anything archaeologists can verify. After kingship descended from heaven, the text reads, the kingship was in Eridu, and then it names a king. Alalim, reign, 28,800 years. The next king, Alalja, reign, 36,000 years. The list proceeds through 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, and 8 kings in total. The reigns are impossible by any biological standard. Some Assyriologists treat them as symbolic, encoded in a base 60 numerical system that may carry astronomical or calendrical meaning. That is a reasonable scholarly position, but here is the detail that keeps stopping me. The city names are real. Eridu has been excavated. Sippar has been excavated. Shuruppak, modern Tell Fara in southern Iraq, was excavated beginning in 1902, and the physical city beneath the ground is genuine. The pre-flood sequence is not built on invented geography. Whatever the reigns mean, the cities were there. The scribes who inserted this prologue into a political document were not working from fiction. They were working from a tradition that knew where these places stood. This is what makes it difficult to simply set aside. A document used for political legitimacy, preserved across multiple independent copies, anchored in real cities, but describing a sequence of rulers whose reigns defy the human lifespan by factors of thousands. The standard explanation is mythological, a legendary prologue representing primordial time, common across ancient Near Eastern traditions, reasonable. Except the scribes who built this document were careful people. They were producing a political instrument, not an origin myth. They did not include things carelessly. The cities are real, the form is deliberate, and the document ends the pre-flood sequence in a very specific place. Not at the most ancient city, not at the most prominent one, but at the last city before the floodline. After the 8th king, Ubatutu, ruling in Shuruppak, the list delivers a single transitional line. The translations vary slightly across the 16 known copies, but the core is consistent. Then the flood swept over. Some versions, the flood swept thereover. That is all. No description, no duration, no account of what burned or drowned or disappeared. The list simply ends one sequence and begins another. After the flood swept over, when the kingship was lowered again from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. And then everything changes. The post-flood kings begin with Jushur of Kish, reign of 1,200 years. Still long, but shorter than anything in the pre-flood sequence by an order of magnitude. By the time the list reaches rulers who can be cross-referenced against other Mesopotamian records, Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose name appears in independent texts, in inscriptions, in a literary tradition preserved across centuries, the reigns have compressed toward the human scale. The document is moving, incrementally, visibly, the numbers shrink toward something a person could actually live. That compression is the argument. The scribes were not carelessly stitching two traditions together. The list has a logic. The reigns shorten, the cities shift, the names change character. And the single line, then the flood swept over, is the hinge. Everything before it belongs to one world, everything after belongs to another. A scribe copying this document in 2000 BCE was already separated from the pre-flood sequence by as much time as separates us from the Roman Empire. Whatever that earlier section was recording, it was already ancient when the standard political use of the king list began. The 5 pre-flood cities are not equal in how they appear elsewhere. Eridu carries the deepest archaeological footprint in Mesopotamia, among the earliest urban settlements the region has produced. Sippar yielded significant cuneiform archives, but the cities at the end of the pre-flood sequence are thinner in the broader record, and Shuruppak, the last city before the floodline, occupies a position the king list never explains. 8 kings, 5 cities. The sequence ends at Shuruppak, not at Eridu, not at Sippar. Ubatutu rules in Shuruppak. Then the flood comes, then the world restarts in Kish. There had to have been a scribe, there had to have been, sitting in a scribal school in Nippur or copying this document for the 100th time, who passed over that line without explanation because no explanation existed in any text he had access to. Who wrote down Shuruppak as the last city, drew the flood line, and moved on to Kish because that is what the tradition required. Who did not ask why the sequence ended there, or if he asked, found no answer in the archive. The document offered him nothing more than it offers us: a name, a city, and a line. The king list does not explain why Shuruppak ends the sequence. It does not record what distinguished that city from the ones that preceded it. It records the name, the king, and the line. Then it moves forward. What it does not contain, another tablet does. A fragmentary text recovered from Nippur, damaged, incomplete, missing significant portions, records the same flood event from a completely different angle. Not a list, a narrative. And in that narrative, Shuruppak is not simply the last city before the break. It is the city that was chosen, the place where a warning arrived, the location that a single god, acting outside the decision of the divine assembly, decided to protect. One city received the information, the others received nothing. Every other settlement in the pre-flood world continued its ordinary existence, unaware that the assembly had already made its decision and the water was coming. The king list records the break without explaining it. The second tablet records the explanation without completing it. Together they describe the same moment from 2 directions, and the thing that connects them, the thing that would close the argument, is the reason one city and one man were selected above all others in the pre-flood world. That reason sits in the space between the documents. That space has not closed in 4,000 years of scholarship. It has not closed because one document has no explanation to give, and the other is missing the section that might have contained one. The text that fills in what the king list leaves blank was sitting in the same excavation. The Sumerian flood story, sometimes called the Eridu Genesis, a name given by the scholar Thorkild Jacobsen in 1981, came out of the Nippur dig alongside the administrative records, the hymns, the school tablets, the ordinary archive of a major Mesopotamian scribal centre. It was identified, catalogued and published by Arno Pobel in 1914. When I first read Pobel's translation and then went back to the king list, the connection was immediate and uncomfortable. The same city, the same moment. 2 completely different angles on the same event, and between them, the gap. The text opens in fragments. Gods are deliberating. A decision is being made. By the time the legible portion begins in full, the decision has already been reached. The divine assembly has resolved to send a flood. The Sumerian tradition imagined its gods as a governing body, a council that met, deliberated, and voted. This was not a single deity acting alone. This was a consensus. The assembly spoke, the assembly decided, and what the surviving text records next, clearly in the section that did not break, is what one member of that assembly did with the decision. His name is Enki. Enki's domain in the Sumerian religious framework is specific and documented across dozens of texts that have nothing to do with the flood story. He is the god of the Abzu, the underground freshwater, and of wisdom, knowledge, magic, and craft. In text after text, Enki is the figure who acts when other gods will not, who finds the solution no one else could find, who holds knowledge others lack and deploys it at exactly the right moment. I kept running into him in the broader archive, the deity who created human beings, who distributed the me, the divine laws governing ordered civilization, among the cities of Sumer, the god of preserved knowledge. And when the assembly voted to end the world, the god of preserved knowledge decided to preserve something. The mechanism he used has been the subject of scholarly attention precisely because it is so deliberate. The divine assembly had taken an oath of silence. The gods had agreed, collectively, not to warn humanity about the coming destruction. Enki was bound by that oath. He could not speak directly to a human being without violating it. What he did instead was speak to a wall, a reed wall. He addressed the physical structure of a man's house, reciting the warning to the material of the building rather than to the man inside. The man, standing nearby, heard what the wall heard. The oath was technically unbroken. The information was transferred. This is not incidental. It is not a folk detail that crept in at the edges of the tradition. It is a legal and theological workaround of considerable sophistication, the kind that requires knowing the rules precisely well enough to navigate around them without formally violating them. The scribes who recorded this were not describing a god who forgot his obligations. They were describing a god who understood his obligations completely and found the exact seam in them where something could pass through. Whatever Enki's reasons for choosing who he chose, the method of warning was constructed to survive divine scrutiny. What the text records next is instruction. Build a boat. Bring aboard the animals, the seed of all living things. The man receiving the warning, Ziusudra, identified in the text as king and priest of Shuruppak, described as a man of great piety who sought divine guidance daily, follows the instruction. The flood comes. 7 days and 7 nights. When it ends, the sun god Utu appears. Ziusudra opens a window. He prostrates himself. He offers sacrifice. The gods, in response, grant him immortality. He settled in the land of Dilmun, described elsewhere in Sumerian texts as a pure, clean, bright place where neither death nor disease exists. He and his wife are placed there, deified, preserved. The text does not record him returning to rebuild anything. He is removed from the world he saved. The seed of mankind he carried forward is not followed in this text. He is taken out of history, placed somewhere that is not quite the world, and the document moves on without him. The Sumerian King List records no king named Ziusudra in the post-flood sequence. He is the last king before the flood line, and then he is simply gone. Not dead, the text says he was made immortal, but absent from the record that continues. History restarts in Kish with different names, and Ziusudra is in Dilmun, which is somewhere the documents do not locate on any map I have found. He's preserved and inaccessible at the same time. The god of preserved knowledge preserved him into a place beyond the reach of the record. Now consider the geography of the warning. Shuruppak is named in the flood text as the city, not a city. That city. Some translations render the address as Shuruppak, a city which thou knowest. The city is invoked as a known place, a real location requiring no further description. The god who warned one man knew exactly where that man lived. The warning was delivered to a specific address in a specific city, the same city that sits at the end of the pre-flood sequence in the oldest political document the tradition produced. Every other city received nothing, not a warning, not a named survivor, not a record of what its kings said or built or believed. 5 cities in the sequence, 1 at the end. 1 man in that city. 1 god, outside his assembly's consensus, who decided that this man in this place would carry something forward that the flood was designed to end. The texts describing every other Mesopotamian city from this period, administrative records, religious hymns, temple dedications, do not record a warning. They record continuity until the records stop, and then silence. What I cannot resolve, what the text itself does not resolve, is the criterion. Why Ziusudra among all the inhabitants of Shuruppak? Why Shuruppak among all the cities of the pre-flood world? The text records the choice, it records the mechanism, it records the outcome. The reason behind the selection is not in the surviving sections of the tablet. Whether it was ever written down at all, whether the missing portions of the Nippur tablet once contained that answer, is a question the clay itself cannot answer. And I keep coming back to that. The oldest version of this story knows everything about what happened, and almost nothing about why. The how is preserved in meticulous detail. The why is the one thing the surviving clay will not give. Here is what the pre-flood kings left behind, beyond the king list itself. Almost nothing. A lulim of Eridu, the first king, reign of 28,800 years, appears in one other known text, a brief mythological fragment, in a context that offers no recoverable historical detail. Al-Aljar, the second king of Eridu, does not appear to be independently attested in any surviving cuneiform document outside the king list tradition. The kings of Bad Tibira and Larak are similarly thin. Ubartutu of Shuruppak, the last pre-flood king, father of Ziusudra in some versions, is named in the Sumerian flood story, which means the corroboration runs in a circle. The flood narrative confirms the name that appears in the list, and the list confirms the name in the flood narrative. Two documents from the same tradition, citing each other. That is not independent verification. That is the same archive referring to itself. I kept looking for the external anchor, the inscription, the temple record, the administrative tablet from another city that mentioned one of these kings by name. What post-flood kings leave behind is extensive. Gilgamesh of Uruk, the fifth king of the first post-flood Uruk dynasty, is attested in inscriptions. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in multiple languages across multiple centuries, in references in hymns and school texts that confirm he was understood as a real historical figure even by ancient standards. Ur-Nammu of Ur left a law code, temple inscriptions, and a ziggurat that archaeologists excavated and that still partially stands. The further you move past the floodline in the king list, the denser the corroborating record becomes. The further back you go before it, the thinner it gets, until you reach a point where the king list is almost all there is. The standard scholarly position holds that this asymmetry is expected. The pre-flood sequence was never meant to be verified. It was a legendary prologue, understood by its original audience as existing outside recoverable time. That is reasonable. It does not explain why the scribes chose real cities for that prologue. Cities that appear in independent excavations, in administrative records, in temple hymns that have nothing to do with the king list. Or why they maintain the pre-flood sequence across 16 copies of a document being used for political purposes that had nothing to do with primordial mythology. They kept it because the form required a beginning, and the beginning had names. What I did not expect when I went further into the archive was how many other traditions kept the same structure. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed across roughly 1500 years, preserved most completely in the Akkadian text recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, tablets dating to approximately the 7th century BCE, contains its own flood narrative. The survivor's name is Utnapishtim. He is a man of the city Shuruppak. A god warns him of the coming flood. In the Akkadian version, that god is Ea, the Akkadian equivalent of Enki, carrying the same domain, the same function, the same role as the dissenting preserver. Utnapishtim receives instructions to build a boat. He loads animals and craftsmen and family. The flood comes. He survives. The gods grant him immortality. He is settled at the mouth of the rivers. The specific details shift. The size of the boat, the duration of the storm, the nature of the covenant. But the architecture is unchanged. A god outside the consensus. A warning to one man, one city, immortality at the end. The structure is identical, the names differ. The city does not. The book of Genesis records Noah. One righteous man, a god who observes the corruption of humanity and resolves to destroy it. A warning delivered to the single man deemed worth saving. A boat, animals, a flood, survival, a covenant. The structure is identical. The city is not named. The survivor's origin is not specified geographically in the way the Mesopotamian versions specify Shuruppak. The mechanism of the warning is different, no divine assembly, no oath of silence, no reed wall workaround. But the kernel is the same, one person, specifically chosen, warned while the world was not, preserved while everything else was destroyed. 3 separate traditions, one structure, and in the 2 that name a city, the city is Shuruppak. The standard explanation for this convergence is literary borrowing, and it is persuasive. The Gilgamesh flood story is almost certainly older in its written form than the biblical version. The Hebrew tradition had documented contact with Mesopotamian literary culture through trade, diplomacy, and the Babylonian exile. The structure migrated. The names changed as the tradition moved to a new audience. This is widely accepted and well supported. It explains the transmission. It does not explain the origin. Because if all three traditions are recording the same underlying structure, the question becomes, what did the earliest tradition record, and why is the targeted selection of one survivor in one city the one element no subsequent version removed? Everything else changes across the three traditions. The names of the gods, the name of the survivor, the details of the boat, the nature of the covenant, the specific mechanics of the warning. In the Genesis version, there is no divine oath of silence, no reed wall, no Enki working through a legal workaround. The specific mechanics are stripped out or replaced. But the structure beneath them, one man, one warning, one city, everything else destroyed, remains. No version generalizes the warning. No version makes the selection random. The targeted choice is the kernel the tradition will not surrender, across 1,500 years of transmission and three completely different cultural contexts. I keep returning to what that implies. If you could remove any element from this story and still have a recognizable flood narrative, you would. Every tradition that borrowed and adapted it did exactly that. They removed what didn't fit their context. The reed wall is gone from Genesis. The divine assembly is simplified into a single deity. Dilmun disappears. The name of the city disappears. But the choice of one specific person remains in every version. It is either so deeply embedded in the original event that no retelling could remove it, or it is the point, the element that the story exists to record. The one thing that every subsequent tradition understood, even if it did not understand why, was that the selection had been targeted. One person, chosen, not random, which returns to the scribal choice. The people who wrote the King List, who copied and recopied it across centuries as a living political instrument, were working from the same cultural archive that produced the flood story. They knew the tradition about Shuruppak and Ziusudra. They knew the reed wall and the divine assembly and the name of the god who chose not to stay silent. They chose to record the pre-flood kings by name, city, and reign, and then they drew a line, one sentence. Then the flood swept over, and started again in Kish. The scribes kept the names, they did not keep the explanation, and the archive has been waiting in that condition ever since. The Nippur tablet that records the flood story was found in the same dig that found the King List. Same city, same archive, same excavation. The University of Pennsylvania expedition that worked Nippur in the 1890s recovered tens of thousands of tablets, administrative records, hymns, school exercises, religious texts spanning centuries of Mesopotamian scribal culture. The flood story tablet was among them. It was identified, catalogued and published by Arno Pobel in 1914. Scholars looking at it immediately recognized what it was, the source tradition behind Utnapishtim, behind Noah, behind the entire chosen survivor structure that three separate cultures had independently preserved. It is broken. Approximately 1/3 of the text survives in fully legible condition. The rest is either gone, damaged beyond reading, or in fragments that have not been matched to the primary tablet. What survives includes the Divine Assembly's final deliberation, Enki's reed wall speech, the construction of the boat, the flood, the emergence of the sun, the sacrifice, and the granting of immortality. What does not survive is the opening section, the part where, in texts like the Akkadian Gilgamesh version, the selection criterion is explained. The Akkadian text preserves a section where the god Ea tells Utnapishtim directly why he was chosen. That section exists in the later version. It corresponds precisely to the damaged opening of the Sumerian original. The answer may have been written on the clay. The clay did not survive that part. The tablet broke where the answer was. This is the condition of the primary source, broken at the opening, legible through the mechanism, entirely silent on the criterion. The King List offers no compensation. The 16 known copies preserve the break consistently, but the pre-flood section itself varies more than any other part of the document. Different king counts, slightly different reigns, minor city variations. The scribes were not working from a single agreed-upon pre-flood tradition the way they were working from a single agreed-upon post-flood political sequence. The pre-flood section was received, not maintained. They kept it because the form required it. They preserved it without being certain they fully understood it. Shuruppak, at least, is not in doubt. I went looking for the city after I found the discrepancy between the two tablets, expecting the archaeology to be thin the way the written record was thin. It was not. The German expedition that excavated Tell Fara, the mound beneath which Shuruppak lies, beginning in 1902 and continuing in a second season in 1931, found a city with substantial material remains. Administrative tablets, grain records, personnel lists, the ordinary documentation of an organised settlement functioning across centuries, and in the stratigraphy, the physical layers of the ground, a flood deposit, a layer of silt consistent with major inundation, dated by archaeologists to approximately 2900 BCE, corresponding to similar flood deposits identified at other Mesopotamian sites including Ur. The city that the tradition named as the last city before the floodline shows, in its own ground, a record of being flooded. That is not confirmation of a global event. Localized flooding in Mesopotamia was not unusual. The region sits between two major rivers in a flat alluvial plain and was subject to regular inundation. The deposit at Shuruppak proves a city that experienced catastrophic flooding, was abandoned, and was rebuilt, which is precisely the structure the King List describes, compressed from one city's history into the hinge point of the whole world's record. The local event became the template became the tradition. The tradition crossed three cultures and still would not let go of the detail about which city. Every retelling stripped something away. The city stayed. Here is what I keep returning to. Enki is the god of the Abzu, the subterranean fresh water, the god of wisdom, craft, and the preservation of knowledge. In text after text, across documents that have nothing to do with the flood, Enki is the deity who preserves things that would otherwise be lost. He distributed the me, the divine laws governing civilization, among the cities of Sumer. He created human beings. He designed the structures of the world. His domain is, specifically and consistently, the preservation of what matters across time, and when the assembly voted to destroy everything, the god of preservation made a choice. He chose one man, in one city. He spoke to a wall to make the warning reach him, and then the flood came, and the god of preservation had preserved exactly one human being from the pre-flood world. What Ziusudra carried is described in the text as the seed of mankind, and the seed of all living things, the biological continuity. What he did not carry, what no boat can carry, is the record. The names of the 8 kings, the order of the 5 cities, the reigns, the knowledge of what that earlier world was. Those things did not float. They survived only because a scribe, centuries or millennia later, included them in a political document because the form required a beginning. The King List preserved the pre-flood sequence not because anyone understood it, but because leaving it out was unthinkable. You could not start the list of kings at Kish. There had been kings before Kish. Their names were in the tradition. The form required them, and so they were copied, generation after generation, by scribes who understood that the form was obligatory even when the content was opaque. There had to have been a scholar. There had to have been, in every generation since Pobel's 1914 publication, who sat with the broken tablet and looked at the gap where the opening should be and understood that the answer was probably there once, who counted the missing lines, who cross-referenced the Akkadian version, who saw precisely where the Nippur tablet breaks and what that break corresponds to in the tradition, who understood that the selection criterion, the reason Ziusudra, the reason Shuruppak, is in the missing section, and who closed the tablet, replaced it in the collection, and went on to the next question, because the missing section is gone. Because counting the missing lines does not restore them. Because knowing where the answer would have been is not the same as having it. The Nippur tablet sits in a museum. The surviving portion has been read and translated by scholars for over a century. The King List exists in 16 versions, none complete, all agreeing on the break. Shuruppak is a real city with a real flood layer in its ground. Enki is the god of preserved knowledge. Ziusudra is the last name before the line, the oldest version of this story. Older than Utnapishtim, older than Noah, the template everything else borrowed from, does not say why. The clay survived, the answer did not, and the archive holds both, what was preserved and the exact shape of what was lost.